Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're wrapping up the engine build here. We've kind of gone through two videos already. Where we left off was we had the engine on the stand, had I believe the short block built. Let me show you where we're at now. It's basically done. So I ran into a couple of things and I started work before setting up the camera, and I was on a time limit, so I just went for it. And basically what it was putting this ATR oil pan on. As you can see, it's a 10-degree pan, so once the engine is in the car, this bottom edge will be flat against the ground. And what I had done was I had actually RTV'd the pan. You can still see a little bit here that squeezed out. And I was putting the pan on and the front cover, and I didn't want the RTV to set before I actually installed it on the engine. So I just kept going. But while we're down here, we can take a look at a few of the parts that did end up going on kind of in between. So like I said, we have our ATR pan. This is the Radium Engineering PCV plate with some internal plating and ducting for the PCV system. This is our knock sensor. This pipe right here is part of the Zero kit, which brings our water inlet or outlet, rather, the up here to the front. On the front, this is a larger pulley than the factory Ford pulley. This is also an ATR part, and what this is meant to do is actually slow the water pump down for higher RPM operation, which is what this motor is going to get. The valve cover went on. I cleaned it up as best I could. I still have the timing plug in here, and that's to finalize the front pulley, get that all done up. We'll get to this in a second. Here on the back of the motor, this is our fuel pressure regulator, also supplied by GBS. What was it? This is our water outlet neck. There's another part that comes up here that will shoot the water up this way. For those of you out there who have early Miatas, first and second gen Miatas, this is effectively your coolant reroute piping orientation. Just in later motors, the Duratec motors, they did this from the get-go. And then on to the goodies. So this is the ATR ITB setup. This is just on temporarily while I was sizing a few things up. Mostly I was looking at plumbing off of our fuel pressure regulator, because there's a hose that needs to come off of here and meet up with this side. The idea is I want to hide as much wiring and plumbing as possible. Basically, I want to do like a wire tuck, and I can show you a couple of things I've done on the chassis to make that a possibility. But back to the ITBs, this was sort of a must-have for me. I know it's just a 2-liter, but it's a hot 2-liter, and something about these cars with ITBs is just a match made in heaven. The whole experience of the car is noise, vibration, and harshness, and what better way to make the engine sing than through a set of ITBs. So these were a must-have in my book. While we're talking about, another thing down here is this is actually a Mountoon oil plate. So this would take the place of your usual oil filter mount. And what we have is an oil inlet and outlet, plus a couple of sensor holes. So I have my oil temp sensor here. And right now it's just a plug, but I need to get an oil pressure sensor to also go in here. And it's not in place, but this is the hole for the dipstick tube, which will come up through here in the middle. The Zero itself has come along a little ways. Kind of spoilers, but I did put the, I got the hood out of wraps, and we put it on the car to do a little bit of prep work. It's difficult to see. I don't know how well this shows up on camera, but we put some basically helicopter tape here across the scuttle where this lip comes down, because on the earlier generation Zeros, the Gen 1s here, this hood actually seals against the bodywork, but in the Gen 2 cars, there's actually a recessed lip in the scuttle, much like there is on the nose here, where the hood just sits down in. And so on the Gen 1 cars, you'll see a lot of builders have done something like this, where they just put some helicopter tape down to protect the scuttle so that the hood can seal against something without damaging paint or, aluminum or what have you. We got the windshield installed. The windshield that I had the factory powder coat the window frame black, and they installed the glass for me, which was great. However, I had to drill these holes to mount the window, and something that Sean had printed out for me is these little blocks here. And what they did was they bolted through these hinge holes like so, and they supported the window so we could clamp the window against it. It set this depth properly, and we could drill right into the frame and not have to worry about going too far one way or the other. So these were kind of a lifesaver, and thank you, Sean, for printing these out. Got our mirrors installed. This body gasket still needs to be, cut to length. There's wires like this on both sides. This is actually for the heated window. So if you're driving in inclement weather and the window gets fogged up because everything's closed up inside, you can actually turn on a window defroster, which is, there's just elements in the glass that heat up the window. I had the same feature set up in the Ultima, and it is a lifesaver. It just really, really helps, especially in a car without a heater like the Zero. Moving on interior-wise, not a lot of changes. I've been trying some different seat mounts and seat mount ideas, and brackets, and how they mount to the seats. The seats themselves aren't bolted to the car yet, but they'll be finalized soon as we're winding things down. I finally put on these beautiful carbon sills. This is also an ATR part, and mounting them is simple enough. They just pop down into place, and then once you have the dash installed, you bolt through it, and that secures these guys down so they're not going to go anywhere. Likewise, there's another bit that comes up here and around the bar, another trim piece, but the parts that I have are, they don't fit this chassis. This tube here is just a little bit too wide for the parts that I've received, and so I'm waiting on carbon bits to match these sills to go here up around the shoulder area. Our rear fenders are now solidly mounted. This fender beading, just like this stuff here, it's actually like a VW part for a VW Beetle. And all you do is you put it between the fender and the body, and it helps fill that gap all the way around to the rear of the car. And then on the rear, you can see I've got the tail lights installed. I've got our reverse and fog light installed. So things are coming together slowly but surely. Let me pull off the hood really quick, and I can show you what I've done with the wiring harness. So anytime I'm working with the car, this is what happens. Somebody thinks we're going to the dog park, and I can't be left alone. And I don't know if he'll be able to ride in this like this when we finish the car, but I don't know if I could tell him no either. So looking under the dash, you can see our fuse panel, relays, etc., and our wiring. And normally it just comes up underneath here. And what I've done is I've actually run it down to the lower leg, all the way down here to the bottom of the car, and then run it forward from there. Down in the engine bay, you can see I've secured it with these P-clips, and then coming forward with these zip ties to the chassis rail. And aside from a few legs here and there, I've secured it to the chassis down low all the way up to the front, where it comes up for the lights on either side and everything in the front. So like the radiator fan and the horn and etc. The goal was, like I said before, I want the engine bay to be clean and basically a wire tuck look. So the idea is I want to try and hide the battery down low. I want the engine really to take focus, but not be no real distractions from wiring and things like that. So what I want to do is I want to be able to hide as much of the engine wiring harness as I can. So things like for the injectors to run our wiring down underneath, and off the back here somewhere that it'll connect up here under the chassis somewhere, and then right up underneath, and really minimize the look and the effect of the engine ancillaries in the engine bay. Another thing that I got done was our brake and clutch pedal. Couple things that I ran into was I had the wrong, I purchased, I should say, the wrong master cylinder at first. This is actually an NA Miata master cylinder, a non-ABS car. The clutch pedal I received, or the clutch master cylinder I received initially was for the later Model Zero. And so I couldn't use that, so I had to go and get, again, an NA Miata bit. However, if you purchase one of these cars, a Gen 2, you'll end up with a newer master cylinder, like an aftermarket one, like AP or Racing or something like that. Our brakes are fully plumbed. You can see our banjo here. Actually, might have a better look from the back here. But you can see everything's plumbed front and back. For our clutch system, I'm using a standard Miata, NA Miata master cylinder. And I've mentioned previously that I'm swapping out the slave cylinder. I can show you that here. So this is the slave cylinder that I'm swapping to. So this was provided by Vitesse, and normally they'll provide these swaps to put this drivetrain into other British cars like MG Midgets and things like that. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to have this same concentric throwout bearing for the Zero, so we don't have the clutch arm sticking off the side here and interfering with the tunnel on the chassis. Down here. And what this does is I still need to drill a hole out of the top here, but there's a pipe that comes off the top and then our fluid feed and bleed will come in through the top here on the bell housing and down in. The only downside to a design like this is that the slave cylinder is inside the bell housing. So if there's a problem with it or if it needs replacing, you have to separate the engine and transmission. However, besides this mounting plate that everything is bolted to, the actual slave cylinder itself is for, I think it's a Volvo and a Land Rover. So I can actually go to just about any parts shop and get a replacement should something happen down the road. And I do like having that feature. So that's sort of a quick update on where everything's at currently. What I want to do is throw in the new injectors into those ITBs and get those all set up so that we can start draping the engine harness over the engine and figure out where things need to be. All right, so set up here kind of in first person mode. I wanted to show you a couple things, a couple features on the ATR intake that I really like. So we're going to pull off the Piper Cross filter really quick. Now, one of the things I really like about the way they set up this intake is you of course have your base ITBs. You have these tunnels, I guess you could say, or the main barrels for the intake, and they actually manufacture different lengths for these barrels, and they just screw on to the actual valve bodies here. The other thing I like is that you have this, one bolt pattern for the actual barrels here, but they've made different adapters to use this setup with different engines. So in my case, this is for a Duratec, but they also have these adapters for a Z-Tech or Miata or whatever. So you can get these ITBs adapted for whatever engine you're using. The other thing is these just screw on. It's all machined in, and it sort of serves double duty because it holds this filter back plate on. And so what we're going to do is we need to pull these off so we can get to the bolts for our fuel rail. But I really do like the way that these horns serve a dual purpose, and I think that's a brilliant way to do things. So we got our back plate off, set that aside. These are the actual seals for the intake. We don't want to lose these. And what we need to do is just undo these bolts really quick. And then once we get these cracked loose, we can grab our injectors. So if, like me, you're running an aggressive cam, or you want to run higher RPMs, or if you're running a boosted application, you're going to want to upgrade your injectors. And so these are a higher flow rate than the stock injectors, and they will offer us plenty of headroom for everything that we want to do. You don't want to install these dry for fear of tearing your O-ring seal. So what I like to do is just take a little dab of oil. You don't need a whole bunch, and you just want enough to wet your O-rings down so that they slip in a little bit easier, like so. And then lather, rinse, and repeat. All right, and last one. So now let's grab our rail. We just carefully want to send these guys home. Just like that. And then we'll just tighten these guys back up. Now you don't have to torque the bejesus out of these things. All you're doing is just holding the rail down. If you torque these down too much, you can damage your injectors. So you want to make sure that you can turn them a little bit. Like so. And that way we can adjust wiring and position if we need to. So ideally, I want to be able to have our wiring pointed down like so, so we can hide it underneath the intake here somewhat easily. And again, the idea being that any wiring or anything we need to, we can run down here underneath the intake and get it out of most of the view. Yes, we can still see the injectors, but our wiring and such is hidden underneath it. If we grab our engine wiring harness, which is this guy here, we can start to lay some of this out. All right, I'm gonna get this tidied up a bit, and then I'll turn the camera back on and show you what I've done. All right, so here's the harness, sort of kind of in place. There's a few additions and changes I need to make, but from the back, so this part of the harness, this goes up to our gauges. This is our ECU, our ground, and it's going to come off the back of the engine, something like this. From there, if we start underneath, we have a oil temp sensor. There is a oil pressure sensor, and I think this is a Deutsche connector. However, I don't have the other half of the sensor. I do have an oil pressure sensor, but I don't have the female plug for this. And the sensor that I have is the wrong size for this plate. So either I need to find an adapter or find a different sensor that has the same outputs that the ECU is looking for, or that the gauge is looking for. Underneath, it's kind of hard to see, but actually we'll go back to the back here. So for the other part of this branch, it'll come around, and I have my oil temp sensor for both the gauge and the ECU. There's this line, which is for a cam solenoid. There is no variable cam timing on this engine, so this is just going to be wrapped up with the rest of the harness. Our coil's in place on the top of the engine. I was kind of doing my best to tuck the wiring down underneath here and get it out of the way, and unfortunately there's not really a good method to get it away from the coils themselves. Our cam angle sensor has the wrong plug on it. I think this is the Mazda plug, and this is the Ford sensor. So either I change the plug, which I have the old harness I pulled off the engine, and I'm going to see if I can just simply swap the plug, or I'll have to go and get the Mazda sensor, which should also just plug down into this hole and work. Following this line, this is for all of our fuel injectors down underneath. It's kind of hard to see, but it'll come underneath. All of our fuel injectors are in the rail. I have to do something with this sensor. This is a map and temperature sensor. And what I might do is just drill a hole in the backing plate of the ITBs and just mount that sensor through. And lastly, the TPS sensor, which I still have to seal and terminate there. And that's pretty much that, all of the sensors and everything on this side of the engine. On the other side, we follow this lead. It's another Deutsche style connector, and this is for the wideband sensor. which I also don't have, and I'll have to figure that out. And these are our leads for our alternator and for our crank angle sensor up here. And those will sort of tuck back behind here. Again, I have to do a little bit of reading and find the plug for the alternator off the old harness. But this is a 2-wire setup versus a 3-wire plug on the alternator. So that's another thing that I'm going to have to figure out and change. But that's sort of where everything sits at the moment. I did get the alternator put on so I could figure out our belt path. When you're looking at belts typically for an engine, if you see some things like the alternator pulley have ribs, and other pulleys like this idler and the water pump are smooth like this, what that means is a ribbed belt like this, like a 5-rib belt, the ribs will go down on pulleys like this one, and the smooth back of the belt will go around the pulley on the smooth side here. So knowing this, the belt is going to have to come around our crank pulley, over the side of our water pump here, around an idler, which I have to pick up, which bolts to the block here. And then it's going to come down through this idler, around our alternator here, and then down around our crank. I don't know the length of that belt. It's sort of a custom length. It's like having AC and power steering delete on a normal either Miata or a Focus. So the simple method to figure that out is to have all your pulleys in place and then use a fabric or a tape measuring line, run the length that you need, and then typically you can find a belt that'll have that length, give or take a 1/2 inch or so, and then you need the number of ribs, so like a 5-rib belt. And it might take a little bit of trial and error with belts around the same sizes. There are different belt manufacturers like Gates and Motorcraft or whoever for Ford, etc. And you can find different belt sizes and applications online. That way when you need to order those belts, you can go in and ask for a belt for whatever application is needed. Sometimes you can find a part number and they'll be able to pull up just a part number for the belt. All right, I think that's going to do it for this go around. I know I'm fairly certain I skipped over a few things on the engine just in what I was filming versus the processes that are actually involved, but I tried to include as much of it as possible. If you do have any questions, just drop them in the comments below and I'll try to answer them as I get to them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.